Thank you. All right. I am going to try and cover a lot of material. So I'm going to try and convince you all of something that you probably believe anyway. So that's a good goal, right? Because you're probably going to be on board with me. So I want to try and convince you that seasonal tributaries are critically important for the fisheries, particularly salmonids in the Sacramento Valley. We live in a Mediterranean climate, right? So we have wet, cold winters and dry, hot summers. We all know that. And we all know that it's an extremely altered landscape that we live in, right? With all these dams and water diversions and all kinds of stuff. And as a result, the Sacramento River itself has lost enormous amounts of habitat. And this includes what we're calling at least off-channel ponds and these seasonal tributaries that flow only partially during the year. And so I want to show you work that my lab did in the past covering these 4 areas. So this is basically the result of a lot of graduate student work. So I'm going to try and show you how important these habitats are for juvenile salmonid growth, the distribution and abundance of fish larvae, macroinvertebrate communities, and this really interesting part, the phenotypic plasticity of salmon. So a lot of this work started out with this particular graduate student, Mike Lim and I, and we were looking at otolith microstructure in juvenile salmon, and this is how small they were, just so you can appreciate how much work he did, removing them and then working with them. And we know that with otoliths, you can actually get daily incremental growth patterns, right? And you can measure the width, and it's correlated with growth. So a larger width for that day indicates larger growth for that day. And what we did is we went out and collected fish out of the Sacramento River from the main channel. This doesn't work very well, but you can see that. And from these off-channel ponds, I'm not going to talk about too much today, and then a seasonal tributary to the Sacramento River. And so we looked at growth rate, and we also looked at food availability. For the aquatic insect people here, this was a really gross measure. We just looked at the number of aquatic insects per unit volume that we sampled. But here's the results. So in terms of growth, the seasonal tributaries in the triangles, the main channels in the square, that's all I really care if you pay attention to right now. Notice that the average daily incremental growth width of these otoliths is significantly larger in the seasonal tributaries than it is in the main channel river, meaning the salmon are growing significantly faster in these little teeny seasonal tributaries that only hold water for a few weeks to a few months out of the year. This isn't that novel, right? A lot of other people have looked at this in terms of floodplains and whatnot, but this is the first time that anyone had seen this in terms of these seasonal tributaries. In terms of the prey availability, not significantly different, but you can see the wide variation, and you can see a definite trend, if nothing else, right? That the seasonal tributaries had generally more food than the main channel, and these off-channel ponds really had a lot. Well, that encouraged us, this body of work encouraged us to do some other work. And so I had a student, Becky Lorig, who went and looked at larval fish in seasonal tributaries. And so her idea was, let's go to 4 tributaries, 4 streams to the Sacramento River. There's Mud Creek, Big Chico Creek, Little Chico Creek, and Butte Creek. I was working at Chico State at the time. 2 of these are seasonal and 2 of them are permanent. They have water every year. And we wanted to compare what was going on there. So in terms of just general gross patterns, the overall number of fish in one of these creeks, Mud Creek, which turned out to be very interesting, right? Orders of magnitude more fish larvae coming out of this thing than anywhere else that we could find. Right? Even the other seasonal tributary here, Little Chico Creek, didn't have nearly as much fish reproduction as we saw in Mud Creek. And we couldn't disentangle the effect that we were seeing with the distance to the confluence. Where we sampled Little Chico Creek was a long way up, and long way up this small tributary, and so it's long distance for the fish to get to. So that's confounded. But Mud Creek did jump out at us. And I want to highlight, Mud Creek was also the warmest tributary that we looked at. So in general, this is just 1 year's worth of data, but we have a lot of it. Mud Creek is always significantly warmer, right? More warm temperatures, more growth, more production. Just to highlight how important and unique Mud Creek is, and maybe it's unique, maybe it's not. We never could determine this exactly. This is just data that my lab collected over many years in a bunch of different streams around Puda Creek right here, the Sacramento River, Big Chico Creek, Mud Creek, and Little Chico Creek. And this is just average native larval density. And you can see that Mud Creek really just jumps out there at you, the 4 years we have there in the red, showing that something interesting is going on there. So I had another student who decided to work on macroinvertebrates, and Gina Benino went out and looked at these seasonal tributaries again, and we did a little bit more isolated this time. We said Mud Creek's interesting, let's focus on that. So we're going to compare the macroinvertebrate communities in Mud Creek in 2 locations, sort of a lower down one and an upper one, and 2 in Big Chico Creek right near, stone's throw away, permanent stream. And she did a lot of work. I wish Gina was here. I always praise her for how much work she did, and then never got to analyze it all because it was just, she took too much data. But the data that we did collect was, that she analyzed, was drift samples, and she ID'd them to genus, which, as many of you know, is a bit of work. And so with some gross measures of macroinvertebrate diversity, things like just drift density, we had a significant effect. The seasonal tributaries were always higher than the perennial stream in terms of just drifting aquatic macroinvertebrates, both in the downstream and the upstream location. But when we look at things like taxonomic richness, we couldn't see much of a pattern. And when we looked at Shannon diversity, again, it's all over the map, so no significant result there. So what we decided to do was ask some questions specifically about the makeup of those communities. And so we turned to non-metric multidimensional scaling to try and answer this. And I'm not going to try and explain the method to people. It's just a multivariate way of looking at stuff. And what you end up with is these biplots, if you will. And each of these is a sample, and if the dots are closer to each other, that means the communities are more similar. And what you can see here is that the seasonal tributaries and the perennial tributaries locations are separated, which is significant statistically, but also significant suggesting that the community in the seasonal tributaries are very different than this community in the perennial tributaries. And this is both for the downstream and the upstream sites, although slightly different, but the difference in the placement of these doesn't really tell us that much, actually. In terms of general overall faunal differences, the perennial tributaries, the drifting insects, we had a lot of terrestrial stuff, probably because of the large amount of riparian vegetation. In the seasonal tributaries, we had a lot of chiros, a lot of zooplankton, and a lot of mayflies. So we saw these differences, which was interesting. And this led to another graduate student tackling what turned out to be an incredibly difficult project. Heather Bowen, who is now a PhD student in Montana, looked at ecomorphological plasticity in juvenile Chinook in the same locations. And this relied on this idea, the statistical framework that was developed by Rolfe, of Sokol and Rolfe, in the 90s, called geometric morphometrics. And this was an alternative to using sort of normal physiographic measurements, or how do you measure shape in things? And they came up with this other way to do it. And it's pretty robust, although it's fairly complicated to do. So what we did is we went out again to Mud Creek, and we went to the Sacramento River, and we collected a bunch of juvenile salmon. And the nice thing about the geometric morphometrics is that you don't have to kill anything got tired of killing things all the time, right? And so what you do is you collect the fish, you anesthetize them, and then you photograph them. And we built this tripod. She was very proud of this. But the thing is, if you put it on there, it's making the photographs be very standardized, as long as you can get the fish to lay down, right? And so once you photograph these, you can look for anatomical landmarks that are conservative and found on every fish, right? And then you digitize the photo and you put on these landmarks. And we found 17 reproducible locations on the fish that we could consistently find on all of them. And then what you're doing is you're creating shape variables from those digitized landmarks. And then you're comparing the shape variables among, in our case, a seasonal tributary and the main stem river. And using principal components and getting centroid sizes and stuff that's, again, fairly complicated, you can see a fairly large distinction between the seasonal tributary fish and those in the perennial tributary, that they're different shapes. And you can dig deeper into this with geometric morphometrics, and you can, oh yeah, there you go. You can use these things called thin plate splines, which are if you put the landmarks on like a piece of mylar and then bent it and twisted it so that it conformed to each other, and then you can compare how the things warped. I know that doesn't sound right, it sounds crazy, but it actually works. And what you see when you do this is that the perennial stream fish are generally smaller and thinner in a depth location, and the seasonal stream fish are larger and more robust, particularly in this sort of depth, body depth that way. And this was significant, statistically really highly significant when we looked at a couple of different measures of this as well. So we found that these fish are different shapes. So literally in these seasonal tributaries, the fish that are literally a few miles, if that, away from the main stem river are growing differently. Like they're physically growing differently, right? Which is crazy when you think about it, or maybe not. So what are the take-home messages of all this? And I know I was sort of jumping through this, but I wanted to make sure I had enough time. I guess I do. The take-home messages are, one, I think seasonal tributaries are a critical habitat and have been grossly, maligned and ignored for all this time. And this is true for fish, salmonids, and non-salmonids. All those larval fish, none of those were salmonids because they just weren't. These seasonal tributaries tend to be warmer, and there's more food there for the fish. Not all seasonal tributaries are created equal. One of the things that we attempted to do, we were never able to do it because of permissions and things like that, was to head up and down the Sacramento Valley and hit a bunch of these seasonal tributaries and see if we could find others that were like Mud Creek. But it could be that these kind of habitats could play a large role in stream ecology of the region, right? If these are actually producing bigger, stronger, healthier, more robust fish, it's a really easy conservation effort to protect them and therefore bolster our fish populations. And so I think they should be a conservation concern. So you can see I have a soapbox I'm standing on here, right? And I have to acknowledge all the people and everybody who helped with all this. This is only a partial list, obviously. And I'm happy to take any questions if you have any. Thanks. Yeah, in the back. Oh, you're waiting for a...
Yeah, sorry. Did you look at the watersheds for each of these seasonal creeks to see where potential runoff or what might, if there's any nutrients or anything associated with...
We did not do any nutrient analysis of these waters. the watershed sizes are incredibly different, right? When I was comparing those 4 in that area, Butte Creek is enormous compared to something like Mud Creek, which is just minuscule, right? And the land use in that area is relatively homogeneous once you get up above the valley floor. And I mean relatively because you could have someone's farm or someone's acreage back there. But it would be interesting, but my guess is the water quality is not the main driving factor. But I've been wrong many times, so I could be wrong on that one. Anybody else? Oh, yeah.
Do you have any idea of why, either how do the different morphologies come about, or what impacts that might have on the behavior or ecology of these fish?
That's a great question, right? It's a great question, and I have no answer for you. I don't know. I don't know. There's the literature on this stuff is pretty minimal. We know that in general, fish that are larger and more robust tend to have longer lifespans and they tend to do better. But in terms of physical qualities, you know, we could talk to someone like Joe Check, who used to be here at Davis, and ask him if there's stuff that you could do with swimming performance or things like that. So I don't know. It's a good question, though. It's really good. It might have nothing, right? It may have no benefit. It just might be that they're bigger. I don't know. But it's tantalizing.
So when you were looking at seed perennial, did you attempt to quantify competition and predation with non-natives that are dependent on perennial flora?
Yeah, so that's and I should have mentioned this. So one of the benefits of these seasonal tributaries is there's no predators in them, right? There's hardly any predators. There's avian predators and there's mammalian predators that get into these, but there's basically no non-native fish in them because they go dry. And they go dry relatively rapidly. So these seasonal tributaries only hold water for 3 to 4 months out of the year, and then they're dry as Jamie's vernal pools. So again, you know, no predators around, you're going to do a lot better. Yeah, good point. All right, well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me.